Welcome to Rapid Prototyping for Virtual Reality. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Great to be here. It's going to be around 45 minutes. I have about 40 slides, so it's quite a bit to rush through. So let me get to my background real quick. So as mentioned, I've written 2 books. First one was a more technical book on how to build applications from scratch without any templates, using visual scripting in the Unreal Engine, and then UX for XR, the most recent one. My background is in design, art direction, interaction design. Then I later moved into 3D and game production, and today into visualization XR. And my focus is mostly on B2B enterprise VR visualization. And I do most of my stuff in Unreal, even though I occasionally deal with Unity as well. And so the topics today are basically actually in 2 sections. So in the first section, I want to look at more at the bigger picture of what the problem of prototyping in XR and VR especially is. I want to see what issues we're facing, what design approaches we have from a design thinking perspective, and how we go about it. And then in the second part, I want to look at some examples and how I would have solved these design problems using the various tools that are available. So the second part is more of a practical, like hands-on part. And before we get into that, I want to quickly go over what the importance of XR prototyping. So, as you guys know, prototyping is important as part of the UX design process. It's important for any digital product, but in XR and especially VR, we have some pretty serious problems because it's a young industry. It's still evolving, still an emerging industry. So we are dealing with quite a number of problems. So one of the biggest problem is actually retention. That's the number one challenge we're facing, because very often people, buy a headset and soon after it collects dust on the shelf somewhere. And if you're an independent contractor like me, that means in an enterprise context that people actually don't end up using the app you designed for them the way it was intended. So, and that's really a problem we need to face in the industry and that we need to solve, And, prototyping has been the secret sauce of the digital economy. If we look back the last decade, the incredible success story of the mobile era with all its unicorns like the Ubers and Airbnbs, these are all UX-driven companies. And I would say the secret sauce has been with the success stories of these companies has been relentless prototyping and iteration of their products. So that's why in the XR industry, we need to figure out how to solve it the same way, we duplicate to repeat the success that we had in the digital economy as the previous decade. The other thing is the other problem in XR we have a number of issues in the industry. One of them is that we have constantly evolving design patterns. And the reason for that is because, it's a young industry, as I mentioned. We constantly have new features added. And once we have new features, we need to figure out how to actually implement them, how to test them. One example I'm showing here is the most recent mixed reality features that are enabled through the last generation of headsets like the Quest 3. And these features are important, especially for user retention, because they make they allow for an easier user onboarding due to the fact that people can ease into the application. Basically, you have a room. Let's imagine a user puts on a headset. So instead of being in a dark place, the user basically sees his environment and a menu in front of him, and then he can actually launch from there into VR. So that's a huge win for user experience. But as designers, we need to figure out actually how to, how do we implement it? How do we test it? We have new things thrown at us, Mesh API, Depth API with occlusion. And again, luckily there's tools, there's a screenshot down here from the Unreal editor. It's easy to implement. And, actually Unity has some new building blocks that makes it easy. But these are just example of the challenges we're facing in a constantly changing environment. And for a moment, I wanna look at the targets, what we actually do, who are we designing for, actually. So at the moment, end of 2023, we have about 6 to 8 million active VR users, and most of them are in VR gaming. And VR gaming, VR gaming has specific routines for user testing. There's a long history of game design procedures. The biggest problem, I believe, is in enterprise VR, education training, previous digital twins, the stuff I do, because here we're facing users that are not regular VR users. So basically users that are not familiar with headsets. And we have to make sure that these users are comfortable with the digital product we're designing for them. And so that's why I'm mostly focusing also this talk on these specific kind of users. Then, of course, we have art house VR, which is very exciting because people test out new crazy ideas. It's very exciting. It's always important to keep an eye on that. And nevertheless, it's not exactly the place for UX because, people do all sorts of crazy things that don't align with UX standards. If we look at let me click here something away. If we look at the problem from a design thinking perspective, we are basically looking at the second diamond. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the double diamond from design thinking, problem definition, solution validation. So that's where actually the problem is, because the challenges we're having is technical complexity, amount of design patterns, and constantly changing conventions because things change all the time. So we have to tackle these issues and find ways to basically find ways to build better products. Another thing is that very often UX designers face when they come from traditional UX, from web and mobile-based UX, is that you're moving from a 2D space to a 3D space. And if we compare design patterns in mobile and web UX to the VR conventions in XR, then in comparison, we have an endless amount of design patterns in XR. Compared to mobile and web design, there is a limited set of basic core interaction patterns. There's only so many things you can do with a flat screen. You can swipe, you can tap, you can, and then you have the various design solutions on how to design your digital product. It's a much narrower field of UX design. While in XR we have a 3D space with endless opportunities of how we can interact with objects, and and the other thing, as I mentioned before, these VR conventions and design patterns in XR, they're constantly evolving. People come up with new ideas, they get adopted, and it's still a young industry. we have to live with that fact for a while. And on the right-hand side, these are examples from my book. So I go all through them in detail in my book. In this talk, I would just want to pick one of these examples, and that's diegetic UI. And if you guys know, you probably know diegetic UI is if the UI lives in the storytelling world of the user. So if your UI lives in the 3D world, then you have a diegetic UI that's part of the storytelling world. While a heads-up display obviously is something that's completely detached from your storytelling world. And same goes for for example, if you take let's say you have an app and you want to design you need a timer in your app. So common wisdom in VR is that you would do diegetic UI because that's a preferred method, because it's most coherent with your VR world, with the user experience, because the user experiences a 3D world. So it would make sense to use a diegetic design, in this case a timer in form of a 3D object, a clock on a drawer, or the option would be to have a wristwatch that has a timer. So these are in tune with the user experience, with real life experience, and it would be very intuitive. And a heads-up display would, of course, be not quite as intuitive, but and it would be not as much preferred. But nevertheless, we don't know if the user we're designing for is actually what actually works for the user we're designing for. That's why we need to test these kind of things. And sometimes we find out, even though common wisdom tells us we should use diegetic UI, it may turn out that the persona, the user we're designing for, actually doesn't, has problems overlooking, not finding the clock or forgetting about the wristwatch. So that's why prototyping is so important. We actually need to validate our design conventions and our design ideas and make sure that actually they work for the user we're designing for. And very quick, some important questions that I usually ask myself before I actually start to design. The most important question, prioritizing. What are the make or break features that need to be tested? Is the app that I'm designing, is it focused on environment exploration or object exploration, or both? Because if it's only object exploration, then it might as well be a mixed reality app. How important is visual fidelity of the space, lighting, realistic materials? Because for example, for real estate, that's very important. And that, if it's important, then you may have to use Unity, have to use Unreal over Unity because it's better for visual fidelity. Are non-standard interactions planned beyond typical grab and activate? If that's the case, then we probably have to find a different solution if we can use one of the standard frameworks. Is Unity or Unreal required or preferred? It may turn out that your stakeholders, or that you, by contract, you're locked into one or the other. But if you have a choice, you need to find out what is expected. Which XR frameworks can be matched with the required interaction design patterns? For me, that's one of the most important things that I always do in the beginning. I try to find out, from the feature sets that I have, what design framework can I match with these basic core features to make my life easier? Do design systems or brand guidelines exist? Do they need to be carried over to XR? If we have a design system and a brand book, so is it important to carry that over? Sometimes actually companies don't want that. They want their XR app to be something completely separate from their brand. That happens. If it's important, maybe you want to carry over your Figma designs, for example. What's my role as a designer in this project? I'm going to talk a bit about that later. And what should be included in the design handover, obviously. So from the design thinking perspective, I mentioned the double diamond. So in my book, actually, I proposed this concept of the overlapping double diamond. That idea behind that is that to make our lives easier and to find solutions early, we actually start to look at design frameworks before we actually finalize the research phase. So that's a concept that I propose in my book, because I want to. This idea helps us to prioritize fast solutions and easy wins. The reason for that is, as I mentioned, the technical complexities, and we want to find ways to do fast prototyping. And another thing in my book, I proposed object-oriented UX. Object-oriented UX is kind of like a niche UX framework by Sophia Prader. She is the evangelist, and she's a very, I think, a very great innovator in this field. So she said, OUX is a philosophy for designing digital systems that respect the fact that people think in objects. So the reason why I think OUX is really works really well in the XR space is because, first of all, it's very intuitive. Second, it is in tune with the game engine mindset, because game engines are usually written in object-oriented programming. So you're already dealing in that mindset. You're dealing with objects and scripts that are attached to objects. You're already thinking in that world. So that's why OUX kind of is complementary to that, and it's natural to a 3D space because we're dealing with objects in a 3D environment. And last but not least, it's less UI centric than traditional flow-based UX frameworks. So in a nutshell, how would I go about using OUX in a VR project? This is a project that was covered in my book. I just want to go over briefly. So going from the final brief, objective, basic structure, deliverables, I would define a persona, needs, wants, pain points, objectives. Then create a user journey map, basically taking the basic structure, seeing what actions does the user take, what touch points do we have, what the user may be thinking at any point, and what opportunities we have to kind of fine-tune everything. And of course, part of that is creating a user story of defining what we actually want to accomplish. As an X, I want to do this and that. And then we can get to the OUX phase, where we actually try to identify objects, their functions, and relationships. And so I find that is a very exciting way of kind of structuring your production. So basically looking at your objects, seeing like what objects are related to each other, what objects reappear, what relationships do we have. So once you do that, kind of like it automatically brings up ideas, and you kind of it inspires your creativity, and then you automatically come up with in my case at least, with great ideas. Create a storyboard, create a prototype based on that storyboard, and then we go about and test and iterate. But of course, the biggest pain point in this process is, how do we actually prototype? It's all fine and dandy, like as long as we sketch something out, do a storyboard, but how do we go about like actually building that prototype? How do we pick the right tools for the job? So that's I think is one of the biggest pain points in XR design. And we have a lot of tools and a lot of ways how to prototype various types of stages of the design. For example, if we want to do just a visual design, a low fidelity mock-up, then Shapes XR is a great tool that you can design in XR using a headset. It's available on the Oculus Quest. Then there's a tool that I like a lot is Bezier. I'm going to talk about it later. It's a web-based web VR tool. And then we have the frameworks for Unity. VR Builder is a great tool for rapid prototyping. We're going to talk about it later. VR Interaction Framework. In Unreal, I use the Advanced Framework. And then we have a lot of plugins for Figma. They are very often only for, like, if you want to test your UI, what it looks like in 3D. And one of my preferred tools to use for spatial layouts is actually Twinmotion. I'm going to get to that later. Before we get to that, I just want to briefly touch on what roles actually a designer has in XR, because in my book I also talk about that a little bit, because in XR design actually comes from the tradition of game design, and game design has certain conventions. There are certain ways of game development, or how you design a game. There's a game design document as the centerpiece of the design. And UX design comes from a completely different culture, and sometimes there's a bit of a culture clash between the game design world and the UX design world. And I mean, both of these worlds actually come together in game UX, because game UX has been around for quite a while, you know, especially for mobile games. It became very popular in the last decade. And in game UX, but you have a clear separation of what the game design does and what the UX design does. The game design does all the game content, and the UX does, you know, the onboarding, the sign up, the, you know, leaderboards, the UI interaction, these kind of things. And if we take a project that's very similar to a game, but it's not quite a game, for example, a gamified learning experience. So the question is, would that require a game designer and a UX designer, or is that something that a UX designer should be doing? So that's an open question, and, you know, there's lots of arguments over that. So I think in the future we're moving towards that UX designers actually expanding their influence and their expertise, and in the end, you can say it's XR design, where you actually design the 3D world. For example, if you have a learning experience, that's an XR, and of course you're doing the UX testing for it. And in the end, very often UX designers call themselves product designers. You know, if you're a product designer for an XR product, then you're basically in charge of the whole product. You know, as simple as that. When we're talking about fidelity, as we know, as you guys know, coming from traditional UX, we have the different fidelities. We have low fidelity, mid fidelity, high fidelity. And XR, we have to really look at how do we define fidelity in XR, because low fidelity is basically in XR, by my definition, is a 3D mock-up with impression testing and minor interactivity. But if you can show it to your stakeholders, do a bit of testing, while high fidelity is clearly a game engine demo with full testing and most interactivity, basically something that you can test on your users. And here's a quote from John Lack's product design of Meta Realities Labs: demos when arguments. If you have an argument with team members, like what's the best solution? Obviously, prototyping is always the best thing if you want to prove your point. And very quickly to go over what topics are good for testing. You know, obviously comfort, intuitive interactions, affordances, using real life knowledge, familiar metaphors. If you have to open a door, you know, obviously you use a doorknob to turn. You use real life knowledge to guide the user. Spatial awareness, you know, we have the low hanging fruit of audio in XR, where you can give spatial cues with audio and haptics, and you can give visual spatial clues as well. User feedback, of course, accessibility, allow customization, progressive disclosure, ease people into the experience, user education, onboarding. Performance optimization that's really the most basic one, low framework, like worst possible UX. And fine print down here, we have the things that are more difficult or almost impossible to test: is user to context, consistent design language, prioritizing essential information, mindful design. That's something I added in the book, because, you know, we're looking at the bigger picture, looking at emphasizing with the user in terms of, overuse, gaming addiction, these kind of things. So these things you would probably not test. Some examples of typical issues I always see, for example, one thing I always come across, and that really bugs me, is when people forget snap rotation, and snap rotation is like missing snap rotation is, like, in my eyes, a very serious UX crime, because it's not very inclusive. You're basically excluding people who are with mobility impairment, people in wheelchairs, or in a hospital bed, people who can't move. So snap rotation should always be there, and very often apps don't have it. It's mind-boggling if apps do not have it. Another typical issue that I come across occasionally is VR embodiment issues. If people don't allow for skin color customization, for example, if you grab an asset from Unreal Marketplace, you're designing your app, and very often you see the user arms. And if these are happen to be white arms, and your users have a different skin color, it's part of their identity, and it's very important to the user. So you need to pay attention to that. And I think very often that's overlooked. So it needs to be there needs to be an option to customize that. And the easiest way to avoid the whole topic altogether is if you don't show any skin, and, for example, use just gloves or something like that. So before we move into the practical examples, I just want to briefly look at different types of prototypes. We have the MVP. The MVP obviously is with the focus of user testing. We have a bunch of features that are viable, and we're narrowing those down to the most minimum we can get away with to actually produce something that can be tested. And but then we have other types of prototypes. One example is a vertical slice. The vertical slice is a different kind of prototype. That's more a product showcase that we show to stakeholders. That, for example, if you want to have a project to get green lighted, or if you need approval from stakeholders, these kind of things. And in the same way, I look at the different tools we have. There's tools that are good for the second kind, for the vertical slice kind, where we want to prove, we want to showcase an idea. And then there are tools that are good for producing an actual testable prototype. So if we look at the ones where we actually want to showcase something, one tool that I use very often is Twinmotion, as mentioned earlier. It's an Unreal-based tool that's very often used for architectural visualization. It's super easy to use, super fast. You can kit bashing. Like if someone wants to wants me to prototype a gym environment, I can kit bash that together in no time. Design it with different materials and have it run within hours. And have it tested, and it can be tested in VR. So that's a great tool if you want to do a spatial layout. Another great tool for spatial layout is kit bashing visual designs in 3D. For example, if you want to do skeuomorphic UI with Shapes XR, which I mentioned earlier. Shapes XR is great because you're working in VR, and that's sometimes super important, because sometimes you need that inspiration. Sometimes if you're stuck, you basically have designer block. You're not getting any good ideas. Once you're in VR and you experience a space, and you can feel things coming together in VR, then it's a huge inspiration, and it's really recommended for specific kinds of project. And ShapesXR is great for especially these UI, skeuomorphic UI kind of things. And it actually allows for some interaction. You can actually design some interactive parts and actually export it to Unity. There is a pipeline for that. But now getting to the projects where I want to do a little bit more, my preferred method is if I do not want to actually prototype animations, but it's still a low fidelity prototype, I would use, for example, Bezier. As I mentioned, it's a web-based tool. And here's a quick example. This is a simplified version of an actual real-life project. I just narrowed it down to some essentials. So basically, health tech VR app for patient communication. Patients are unsure; they feel uncomfortable. They're worried about an operation, and you as a hospital, you want to show them, you want to ease them into it, you want to explain things. You can play some comforting music in the background. So that's a great way to explain patients what needs to be done to make them comfortable. And in this project, as I mentioned, I'm using Bezier. The workflow for Bezier is pretty straightforward. I design my stuff in Blender, and I do my UI screens in Figma, and then I bring them together in the browser, in the Bezier browser, and on my PC. And once I'm happy with everything, I can mirror that browser on my headset browser, and then it's in VR, and I can test it. And it's simple as that. And the way I go about it is basically modeling and gray boxing stuff out, blocking out geometry in Blender. So basically here I have the 4 different rooms that I want to prototype. The first one is the welcome room. The second one is the information room, explaining the organs and how they function. The third room is the surgery room, where the procedure is explained. And the fourth room is the aftercare room. And, I'm posing. We have this really simple model that I pose, and I assign different colors to it. And basically I keep it to the very minimum. And then I do some basic animations, and the animations I do following a script. The script I record with my own voice, so to have a timeline. And so by the timeline, which I import into Blender, then I have the timing, and I know exactly how long each segment is. And with that, I design the explainer for the inner organs, and then the surgical explainer. And then I can export that whole thing. And then I go into Figma, design my 4 UI screens for the different rooms. So here I have my first room, the welcome, then the information room, the surgery room, and the aftercare room. And so then here's the Figma browser. So I'm basically importing my screens and my Blender geometry, including the animations. So it's as simple as drag and dropping that into my Chrome browser, and it's super easy and super fast. And Bezier is really very intuitive. It's very straightforward, and the cool thing is you can design basic interactions. So basically, it has a what's called a state machine, and the state machine allows you to design different states of your objects that you can activate. In this case, I want to have the user go from room to room. So these are different stages that are activated by the menu. And the way I go about it is looking at a very practical example here. Basically, what I do is in Figma, I separate the buttons from my menus, separate them into different frames. And that's important because I want to be able to copy the link. And before I actually do that, I have to connect the apps. There's a token with Bezier that allows me to connect Figma to Bezier, and once I've done that, I can basically copy that frame and paste that into a plane that I created in Bezier, and paste that frame in there. And the cool thing is I can actually automatically bring it to the correct size, which is super cool. And then I design the basic interaction. In this case here, it's basically this button. Once this button is pressed, the button has actually 2 stages. The non-activated stage has a 50% opacity or 70% opacity, and the activated stage has a 100% opacity. And once this button is pressed, it activates that room. So it's as simple as that. And basically, this is about it for this simple design. Basically, what I wanted to prototype is the user going from room to room, activating the animations, learning the learning experience. And it's basically an interactive presentation where the user decides where to go and what to see next. And in the handover, I basically would hand over the Bezel preview link, the actual 3D objects, the animation with audio, because Bezel actually doesn't allow for audio. We have to, if you want to hand it over, you actually have to, for communication purposes, do a preview render in Blender with the audio, so people understand where things have to go, the audio files and the UI files, and basically the job is done. So that was just a simple example of how I would go about it. Then a different example, this would be one where I have a project for safety training, and I want to do more of a high fidelity testable prototype in VR Builder in Unity. So VR Builder is a great tool. It's super easy to use. It's super fast. And here it's important that it's testable, because you're probably addressing users that are not very, they're not very used to VR. And the company that wants to train people on this, they want the users to be able to immediately understand how this works. And you have to make sure that this actually works for that user type. So project brief, we want to do the safety training on the forklift for transportation of dangerous goods. And because very often it's not done correctly, and the solution would be the immersive guided experience that explains what exactly needs to be done, and in the end you get a completion notification. So basically, in setting up VR Builder is super straightforward and super easy. It's really a very smooth experience. You just have to install it. It automatically installs all the dependencies. You import your objects. I have my forklift here. The blue box is my dangerous goods. The two yellow boxes are my lock items that I have to go on the left and the right side of the blue box on the forklift. And then in VR Builder, what I do is VR Builder has a super cool feature, which is called the process editor. The process editor lets me actually take these objects and assign interactivity to them, and assign a process, basically a user process to the experience. And in this case, is basically we have at the beginning, we have the user is facing the two connectors, and we want the user to grab the connector and take that connector and connect it to the forklift, and there's actually a snap object in that place. And the other cool thing that VR Builder has, it has actually text to audio, so you can quickly prototype audio instructions of what to do, and that makes it super fast to quickly give guidance in audio. And basically, here you can see you mount the first connector, then you grab the second connector and mount the second connector, and on completion, you basically have a confetti machine that actually blows confetti over the user, and that tells you, "Hooray, you made it!" I actually put it into the text to audio. You made it. So basically signaling to the user, basically you've completed your first task. So this is a great way to actually test interactivity super fast. And this is basically, of course, just a tiny segment of a snapshot of what a training app would look like. But because of this is so easy, it's great to go and take it, grab a user and actually test it with the user and interview the user, and watch the user, what the user does. If you find any issues, if people not finding what they need to do, you need to tweak it until it's right. So basically that's, as I mentioned, the secret sauce of the UX design process is basically validate your design, iterate until it sticks. The next project, and this is the last project I want to talk about, is a high fidelity testable prototype using the advanced framework for Unreal Engine 5. So in this case, I'm using the Unreal Engine 5 because this project would require more visual fidelity, more environment features, and the advanced framework for Unreal Engine 5 is very customizable. So the project brief here is we have a VR app for a charity event planner. Problem is you have a high profile event with VIPs and you have limited access to the location before the event. You want to plan with your staff how to decorate, how to put equipment, event presentations and stuff. So the solution here is to do an immersive digital twin of the location that allows the setup and training in VR. In my case here, I want to show how we can actually train a user and how to decorate the place and where to put the plans that need to be placed. So in Unreal, I would take pictures of the space, what it's supposed to look like, and kit bash that with marketplace items from the Unreal marketplace. Try to match, of course we would have the measurements, and you try to match it as possible, as close as possible, and then populate the room with the geometry. That usually is very fast in Unreal. And then I set up my advanced framework. Basically, I import this room into the advanced framework, and I need to activate the framework in that project, that it becomes available for the framework. Super easy to do. And then the framework allows me actually to customize it. In this case, I wanted to have hands instead of controllers. Very easy to set up. The cool thing is in the advanced framework, you can really customize every little thing. You can customize, and here's a snapshot of the settings for your hand controls, for the controller functions. If you wanted to, you can assign any of these functions to, for example, have a pop-up menu or these kind of things. And so that's super easy and fast to set up. The next step would be to actually make the objects interactive. So I bring in, for example, the objects that need to be placed. In this case, these are plans that need to be placed in that room. And to make them interactive, I just have to convert these objects into blueprint objects. Basically, very easy to do. And then once they are an actual blueprint game object, I just assign the grab component to them. And at the moment I do that, they become grabbable. As you can see on the right-hand side, I can grab it with my glove and carry it around in the room. So that's super fast and easy to set up. And as a last step, I want to have a spatial UI, a UI that basically pops up when I enter the space. And in here, I want to be able to show, to allow the user to show the different zones I have in that room. For example, in this case, I want to show the user, so these are the activity areas that are off limits. So basically what I do, I put some basic geometry there, design a see-through material that I assign to it, and then make these objects invisible. And then I import a Figma UI that I rebuild in the Unreal widget designer. And then I can assign functions to these individual buttons. And for example, if I have the button show activity areas, then these blue zones would pop up to communicate to the user, okay, these are the areas where I can't put my items. So I can't decorate these areas because these are off limit. So this is just an example of how to quickly put together a prototype. And then, the last question is, actually, how do you test? Recently, Meta has released a new feature called Release Channel URL Invites, and playtesting feedback is brand new. It's pretty cool. So basically, you can send out URLs so people can pick up an app from an URL and actually test it through and leave comments in it. That's especially good if you have in game design, for example, where you have users that actually say, okay, this doesn't work for me. This is too big. This is too small. These kind of things. But of course, you also have classic user testing, which I most of the time do. Is basically what I would do is do the classic user testing with shared screen. I have the user in the headset. I broadcast the screen to my laptop, and with the shared screen, I can see what the user does, and then I have a catalog of questions and ask the user, yeah, can you do this? How would you go about doing this? And then observe and take notes of where there's issues and find out what areas can be tweaked and what can be improved. So I think we're at 45 minutes now. So that's basically it for now. Conclusion, as I said, research is key. XR frameworks matter. It's very important to have an overview what framework does what. These designer roles can vary a lot. Tool choices very often are make or break, in my opinion. Successful products means you have to test and iterate. Thanks a lot. Any further questions? My email is here. My MetaQuest username is Cornel. If you're up to it, I'm always open to a game of tennis or mini golf. Thanks.
Any advice on how to do a usability test with XR? I could see this being more complex rather than a typical desktop or mobile usability test.
Yeah.
Any difference there?
As I mentioned in my last point, so basically the classic way in XR would be to do it with a shared screen. You basically you mirror the headset on your laptop, and basically you ask questions and observe what the user does. So that's the way I usually do it. And as I mentioned, the new features by Meta that actually allow comments on tests, that's also great for usability testing. So if you want to send it over to someone and say, hey, let me know if this works for you, and people can leave comments on the actual interactive objects.
What is the percentage of enterprise users from total VR users?
See, the problem in XR, we don't have exact numbers because Meta, which is the biggest player, doesn't release numbers. They don't give out numbers, user numbers, nothing. So we only have estimates, and also like companies very often don't talk much about it. There's often apps that you never hear about, and there's really no statistics on it. We can just estimate, and I would say like maybe 5% or something. I mean, we have to, if enterprise includes also like productivity, I would say productivity, learning, education, these kind of things. There's actually quite a lot of projects. If you take everything into it, I would estimate that to be about 5%, but growing.
Okay. To do rapid prototyping, which tools minimally must an XR UX designer developer be able to use? It seems like you use a fair number.
Yeah, so I think it's good for the XR designers to actually have an understanding of all the tools. You don't have to actually be good at all these tools. I think it's important to have an overview of what there is and what functions, what these tools do, and then kind of like specialize in a handful. And as you're dealing with this 3D space, you have to get comfortable with 3D. So I would say it's good to know Blender or any other 3D software, and then you can start with Shapes XR. It's a great tool to test things out in VR. It's very user friendly. And Bezier is my favorite tool for quickly testing something, because you can just throw things into a browser, get something from Blender, throw it into a browser, and see it in your headset. It's super easy and fast. So it's Bezier.com. They just changed the name from Bezel to Bezier. And I just saw it yesterday. They got Series A funding, so they're going places. So
Okay, we have some more questions. Elio asks, what do you think is the bottleneck that prevents the diffusion of AR, VR compared to other technologies?
but what do you mean by diffusion?
The dispersion, the adoption, pickup, the broad use
Okay,
of, I guess.
what's the bottleneck? Yeah, I mean the
Yeah.
bottleneck is indeed for a lot of people. Of course, there's a lot of different opinions on it, but we have the problem that with comfort. A lot of people are not comfortable wearing a headset, so the headsets have to become lighter. And we had the issues with people feeling isolated, these kind of things. And I wrote an article a few years back that was titled "Is Immersion a Preference?" Because in that article I had the thesis that actually some people prefer immersions while other people actually don't care for immersion, and there's actually people who really don't care much for immersion and other people love it, and I think and I think an important stepping stone that we have now is those mixed reality that makes it much easier to dive into VR, because by my experience is the worst thing usually for new users is to put on a headset and be in a dark room. That's very disruptive. It's uncomfortable. People feel disoriented. And these kind of things are really serious UX issues, especially for onboarding new users. And things like mixed reality really help to ease people into that. And I think these bottlenecks will be addressed in the near future. And I think we're slowly getting there.
How far are we from having VR in our daily lives as just another element like a smartphone is now?
In my bubble, it is already part of in my VR bubble where everyone uses VR. It's already part of my everyday life. So I meet my friends in VR every day, and but of course that's not typical. But I think we'll see that it's going to take a bit. I think it's going to be. I would think another 2-3 years until it's very common. That's my estimate. Because next year we have the Vision Pro by Apple. I mean, that's going to take a year until it really gets any traction. It's so expensive and it will not be available. So until they really have a second version, it's probably going to be another year. So I would say within 2-3 years we will get there.
Nikki asks, or says, curious to know if it's possible to use 3D apps like Spline or Womp to export to Blender/Unity if one is just getting started with creating 3D assets, or if it's not recommended for some reason.
I think Spline you could actually use. As far as I know, it has export capabilities. As long as it can export 3D objects, which I think it can. You can actually use use any 3D tool, including Spline, to set up a 3D scene, and then take your design and take it into, for example, ShapesXR or Bezier. So no problem.
How do we think AI will be used to create XR experiences?
Yeah, AI, of course, is already in use in some apps. What we can expect more, for example, if we have for example games, NPCs, that's the next target. Non-player characters will be AI driven, that's for sure. There's already some examples where when you interact with, you have an app, you're greeted by, let's say you have an enterprise app, there's a lobby and you have a concierge or something, then you would talk to that person would guide you. That could be an AI-driven character, and same as NPCs in games. So these things are already on the way. And another thing is, of course, next to user-generated content, we will have generative AI building 3D objects, prompting 3D objects that can populate 3D screens, maybe 3D spaces. and we already seeing that happening.
Mhm.
It's going to be a while until that is actually until that is polished. At this stage, it's a little rough around the edges, but it's getting there.
In your experience, how difficult can it be to allow people with no digital culture approaching this technology for the first time?
That's actually a great question, because actually I think a well-designed VR app should be very intuitive to a person that has never used any digital product. And we see that, for example, very often there's, for example, XR apps that are used in hospitals for the elderly, or for people who are, who don't have much social interaction. And these people very often have no problem picking it up, because if you design the app with familiar metaphors that are very using familiar metaphors from real life, from the user's real life, then of course it becomes super intuitive to use, and that's of course the goal of a designer. So I think that's very doable.
Would you recommend to build VR prototypes for UX research, maybe to validate potential experience in a conference room? Can you see any risks?
What do you mean by in a conference room? I don't quite
I
understand.
am not clear on that. Maybe to
Yeah.
validate potential experience in conference room. I mean, I think maybe to share the experience that
Yeah, I
somebody might
think
be building.
that's totally that's absolutely okay. If you, I mean, if you want to, test a design, I mean, that's actually very quite common. If you want to, for example, for impression testing, right? For example, if you have a VR design and you have a spatial layout and you want to test it on your stakeholders, you want to get approval, you want to see,
Mm, mm,
is that what we're shooting for, and
mm.
you want to quickly show it around. That would be a very obvious idea to bring it to a meeting to pass the headset around for everyone to have a look and say, oh, this is awesome, let's go for it, or say, oh no, we can't do that. So I think it's very doable. Yeah.
Thanks very much again, Cornel, for that very interesting talk. Thanks, everyone, and we will leave it there.
Okay, bye
Bye.
bye.